Hello, everybody. Yes, I'm going to talk about some of the recent key finds we've had in the first 2 years of the Magna Project. But just as a starter, give a little bit of background to the site and the project. So, Magna is a Roman fort built along the line of the Staingate in northern Britain, and it's built at its junction of the Staingate and the Maiden Way coming up from the south. And you can see here on this map, it's very close to the line that was then taken by Hadrian's Wall. So in the early 2nd century, it was incorporated into the Hadrianic frontier as that was being constructed. Today, the site is part of the Vindolanda Trust and also includes the landscape surrounding the fort, the civilian settlement, but also parts of the Hadrianic frontier, the Vallum and Mile Castle 46. The Magna Project itself is a 5-year NLHF funded project to investigate Magna Fort and this surrounding landscape, excavating from the north to the south of the site across the 5 years to create a transect through all the different archaeological spaces that it covers, starting up in Area A, where we dug Mile Castle 46, the Vallum, but also looking for the road network that would have connected the fort to the Mile Castle. Then moving down into Area B, where we were targeting a well complex that was visible in the field along with the northern fort ditches, and then ending in Area C inside the fort itself, focusing on the praetorium and the southern defences of the fort. Alongside this, we have continual monitoring ongoing to investigate the impact of climate change on archaeology and preservation conditions underground. And so far, in the first 2 years, we have excavated all of the trenches in this northern fields up here. So all of Area A and the first two of Area B. Today, though, I'll be focusing on the finds from Area A, as this is where most of the Roman material has come from up on the frontier. So last year, in year one, we excavated the eastern half of Mile Castle 46 and its extramural area. Interestingly, when we excavated this, we found no internal buildings inside the Mile Castle. We had been expecting barracks. Instead, we found a Roman well. And in the extramural area, there was a series of large pits to the east, and then extensive cobbled yards and the start of that road network heading back towards Magna Fort. Moving on into this year's excavations for year two, we excavated a trench targeting the Vallum and its turf mounds, and then moving south from the Vallum towards a large ditch that had not previously been identified on site or investigated. This proved to be pre-Hadrianic, early Roman military ditch, and could possibly be part of an earlier iteration of Magna Fort or an annex to the fort. With such a short slice across it, it's a little bit hard to say exactly what it's for at the moment. And we also continue to trace that road network heading south from the Mile Castle down towards the Vallum and found our second well. So a project that was supposed to have one well has currently got 3 wells. Right up in the north corner of the trench, there was a nice little stone-lined well on the roadside. But to get into some of our finds for the Roman finds group, last year, one of our key finds was this jewel balance. It was found outside Mile Castle 46's east wall, and this is one of only 14 found in the UK to date, and is the first to have been found on Hadrian's Wall itself. A couple of examples have been found at other northern military sites, but not directly on the wall. It's made of copper alloy, and you can see in the inset photo, it's got silver or yellow circular insets evenly spaced out along one of the arms to act as increment markers. This is to do with how jewel balances were used. You could either place weights in pans suspended from the end of each arm using that little loop, or you could hang a weight directly on the arm like a steel yard and move it along the arm to change the weight distribution of what you were trying to weigh. You can see it's quite small and delicate object, and so would have been used to weigh small quantities of more high value material, things like silver, glass beads potentially, precious stones, or material that we don't see in the archaeological record, like spices and medicines, could also have been weighed out with an object like this. They're generally associated with jewelry making or textiles and other depictions and records of these objects. which raises the question as why is it in a military outpost on the Roman frontier? And along with some other evidence that we've had from the site, this all sort of ties into the Mile Castle being not just a military outpost, but also a trading hub with connection onto several Roman roads like the Staingate and the Maiden Way. It's a really good place to cross the wall either from north in Caledonia to bring material from there into the empire, or for an entrepreneuring craftsperson or trader to take material from the Roman Empire out to the people beyond the wall and trade across borders like with them. The other discovery from outside the walls of Mile Castle was a kist grave. So this was located in the corner formed by the east wall of the Mile Castle and the south side of Hadrian's Wall. You can see on the excavation photo that the sides were lined with stones, but there was no capping stones in the grave, nor was there any base stones under the skeleton. And this grave contained a single inhumation. The bones were in very poor condition, sadly. None of them came out the ground as intact as they look in that final photo, but we were still able to learn a variety of things about this individual. The position of the bones in the grave that you can see in these images tells us this individual was most likely wrapped in a shroud before burial. The legs are extremely close together, and the ribs, which you can see here in this part of the grave, are vertical, parallel with the spine, which is a position your ribs should not be in. And this suggests that the body decomposed in a very tightly contained space. We have no evidence for any sort of a coffin, so it's likely that it was wrapped tightly bound up in a shroud. Peptide analysis of one of the teeth has identified this individual as biologically male, and the teeth have also given us a potential age of over 55 based on the wear pattern, possibly significantly over 55 given how worn down the teeth were. And the last measurement we've got from the skeleton is the length of the femur taken in situ gives us a height of around about 5'2". So we're looking at a short, older man being buried up here. The grave itself also gives clues to this person's identity. It is oriented east-west, which would suggest an early Christian date, as does the lack of grave goods within the burial. And the other dating evidence we have is that the overlying deposits contained Huntcliffe ware pottery, which puts this burial into the late Roman period. This aligns with both an inhumation as opposed to cremation burial and the potential Christian nature of the remains. Moving on to the space between the Mile Castle and the Vallum as we moved south with our excavations, we have found a sort of scattering of glass beads. 6 have been found in total in this area. We've had 2 of the blue square section beads that we have here, and then 2 of these red, white, and blue square section beads. 1 very nice golden glass bead that came out the ground that shiny, which was a very exciting day for the volunteers, and 1 green hexagonal bead as well. You can see on the map these have all been found in the space outside the Mile Castle and between it and the Vallum, and all but 1 were found on either the road surface or a surface of one of the cobbled yards. The outlier is this little bead here, was found in the bottom of the roadside well I mentioned earlier. So still in association with that road network, with people moving through the area. And the question is then, how did they get there? They could have been goods being traded as raw material, potentially someone who's traveling with a dual balance and wants to weigh out quantities of glass beads that they are trading in, and they have dropped a couple while they have been moving through this space, but they could also have been lost from an item of jewellery by a wearer, which adds to the picture of non-military activity in this space, potentially women, certainly civilians, in and around what's normally traditionally seen as a military outpost. I don't know how the volunteers spotted them, given some of them are 3mm long as well, but I'm very glad that they did. Continuing south into the Vallum itself, we have fragments from a handful of Roman ceramic roof tiles found in the lower fills of the Vallum that were building up during the Roman period. The one I've put on here is largely complete and also has the nice detail of having a paw print, just a nice real world connection to have rather than plain blank tiles. And these aren't always the most traditionally exciting material for people to look at from Roman finds, especially bulk finds like CBM. Can't necessarily always tell you a lot, but in this case, they give a really interesting insight into construction of the Mile Castle because that is the only structure close by to the vallum for these to have originated from is part of Mile Castle 46. Based on our excavations, we have no internal buildings like barracks that could have had a tiled roof, which means the only other possibility is that it came from the roof of one of the towers, either over the south gate or over the gate through Hadrian's Wall. And this is really interesting tidbit to add to the discussion because there's a long ongoing debate about what did the top of Hadrian's Wall look like and what did the top of Mile castles and turrets, roofs, how were they built? Were they flat, observation posts, tiled? So at least at Mile Castle 46, we now have something to suggest it could have had tiled roofs above the gates. Also found in association with the vallum, we had a set of cremations. So you can see up here, this little cluster of blue dots is our cremation burials. We had 4 cremations in total cut into the north berm of the vallum, immediately south of its northern turf rampart. And all of these burials came up in a very tight cluster. They were also all formed nice discrete deposits rather than bigger spreads, suggesting that they had originally been buried in some form of a container, which has now decayed away, potentially looking at something like a leather or a cloth bag that has not survived but did contain the material when it was placed in the ground. The 5th dot up in this area is the location of a larger pit which contained charcoal and bone from multiple cremations. It was sort of roughly stratified deposits with different levels of bone preservation and burning throughout, indicating it had been used and filled in gradually over a long period of time with multiple depositions. This has been interpreted as debris left over from raking out a pyre after the main cremation. So they have burnt their dead, buried the remains that they wish to bury, and then cleaned up after themselves and put whatever they raked away from the pyre into this pit. The date ranges for these cremations go from 118 to 376 AD with the radiocarbon dates. They all cross over the 3rd century in some capacity, suggesting that's the most likely time for the cemetery to have been in use, also tying in with preempting the arrival of inhumation as a burial practice that we saw further to the north. These were not our only cremations, however, in the site. We had a second set of cremations come up at the southern end of the trench. So these were south of our large pre-Hadrianic military ditch. And in this cluster, we had a total of 7 cremations. You can see on the aerial photo with the colored dots again, 5 of them forming one tight cluster, and then 2 more cut into the edge of a small ditch. And this ditch actually contained the pyre site as well. So the large black rectangle I have drawn in the map here is where the pyre was located. And the earliest cremation in this cluster was slightly different in that it had been buried in a box rather than in any sort of bag. But the rest of the cremations seem to tie in with their northern counterparts, being buried in some sort of an organic container bag made of leather or cloth. Across both groups, again, there was no grave goods found directly in association with the cremated burials. However, the pyre site did contain some pottery, and throughout the cremated bone, we found occasional fragments of animal bone mixed in with the human remains, which would indicate that rather than burying grave goods with the cremated remains, they are placing any offerings or grave goods onto the pyre with the individual and burning them, and then taking the remains out of the pyre to be buried. The pyre, like the pit, the larger pit further north, also seems to have been used for the full duration of the cemetery with multiple events of burning and then raking the pyre site ready for the next person who may pass. And the date range for these is also very similar to the northern cluster. Again, we've had radiocarbon dates done for all of them at this point. So we have 110 to 381 AD, all overlapping somewhere in the 3rd century. So suggesting that this is a post-Hadrianic 2nd century, 200s AD burial practice in the area. Moving into our large ditch, military ditch itself, this was our first major deposits of anaerobic material. Anyone who's familiar with Vindolanda site and the ground conditions there will be familiar with the scent of anaerobic and this oxygen-free preservation environment that it creates. So we had a total of 8 shoes this season. 7 of them came from this pre-Hadrianic ditch. We had one outlier. This shoe at the bottom right of the slide came from the vallum and had been preserved in heavy waterlogged clay rather than anaerobic material. But the other 7 came from the traditional anaerobic preservation layers inside this military ditch. We had both adult and children's shoes in the mix here. At least one of them has been identified as a soldier's marching boot, this nicely photographed example from the lab. All of our shoes are currently pre-conservation. They have been cleaned but not gone through conservation yet, but we do have plans for full analysis and conservation treatment over the winter, so you may well hear some more about the Magna leather coming in the future from that. The other objects, a couple of other objects benefited from being preserved in the anaerobic material of the ditch. We had a very lovely piece of Lorica squamata scale armor come out. As you can see here, we had 4 scales of the armor still linked together with their connecting rings. So they came out all attached and very delicate. Everyone was mildly terrified to handle them, but being in the anaerobic soil has significantly reduced the corrosion on them. And so when they first came out the ground, they had that beautiful copper sheen to them, which was very nice to see as our first sort of metal artifact come out, minus all of its typical green corrosion for copper alloy or rust for iron. And the last object I'm going to talk about today also came from this ditch. It was actually one of our first finds, and the first small finds from this ditch, the first one to come from those anaerobic layers. And it was this piece of worked antler. It's a small part of a small cup from the neck. And you can see here it's got some lovely decoration with incised lines around the neck and then the triple bevel design on the rim. Given how small the fragment is and the size of the extrapolated diameter, the question was what was it used for? And potentially this could have been part of a dice shaker, not quite on the scale of the dice tower from the Legion exhibition at the British Museum earlier this year, but nonetheless still a really nice object and giving us evidence of both work and play for the soldiers in this area with the marching boot and the armor, and then a dice cup for their leisure time. That sort of gives a quick overview and a roundup of the material we've had from the first 2 years. Next year we move into the northern ditches of the fort, so we're looking forward to see what we get from there. Thank you.